In this section, we'll learn about different Vray geometries like Vray Proxy, Vray Fur, Section Clipper, and stuff like that. And we start this section with taking a look at Vray Proxy. Vray Proxy allows us to render extremely heavy scenes with hundreds of millions of polygons, which is not possible without Vray Proxy. The way Vray Proxy works, it imports geometry from an external mesh on your disk at render time only. The geometry is not present in 3ds Max scene and does not take up any RAM. The dragon model we have here in the scene is a fairly heavy model. It has almost 400,000 polygons. Rendering a few of this model maybe isn't such a problematic issue, but if I want to have 200 of these dragon models in my scene, that would be about 80 million polygons. Now, handling such a heavy scene is going to be problematic, and as it's going to need tons of resources and memory on your machine. Let me just quickly open up Frame Buffer so we can see what we currently have in the scene. And also, there is some color correction going on applied to this render. To import the mesh file that we want to use through the Vray Proxy object, that you can find it here in the Vray toolbar, first we need to export our object to a .vrmesh or Vray mesh file. Simply right click on the object and choose Vray mesh export. And after we exported the file, we can bring it back using Vray Proxy object and distribute as many of it as we want in the scene. Up here in the folder section, you can specify where you want your Vray mesh file to be exported. So let's click on the browse button and go to the proxies folder of the project files folder for this lesson, or it can be export folder, it really doesn't matter, and press OK. Down here you can specify the name of the .vrmesh file that will be exported. Dragon.vrmesh is going to be okay. We have two options to export our object or objects. The first one is export all selected objects in a single file, which takes all selected objects and merge them into one mesh file, and then all of those objects that will be stored in one .vrmesh file can be brought back into the scene using one Vray Proxy object. And we have export each selected object in a separate file, which exports one .vray mesh file for each selected object. The name of each file is derived from the name of the corresponding 3ds Max node. In this case, we only need to export one object, and you can use both of these options, but in this case, let's use export all objects in a single file. The next important option is automatically create proxy. This option is not enabled by default, which I think it should be. When enabled, immediately after you click on this OK button and export your mesh, Vray automatically creates proxy object or objects for the exported meshes. The proxies will have the correct transformation and materials derived from the original object, and the original objects will be deleted. Let's make sure this option is enabled. The next important option is down here, which is create multi-sub-object material. This option is available when multiple objects with different materials are exported. So if I enable export all selected objects in a single file, now you can see create multi-sub-object material becomes available. When enabled, Vray will assign a multi-sub-object material to the created proxy, and the sub-materials will be assigned to the appropriate objects or faces automatically. But if the mode is set to export each selected object in a separate file, and like here you are only trying to export one object or even multiple objects, and you have multi-sub-object material applied to it, it will be saved in the Vray mesh file and will be rendered just fine when you bring it back using Vray Proxy. Obviously, if you are trying to export an animated mesh, you need to enable export animation and define the frame rate. Using export point cloud, here when enabled adds a point cloud representation of the mesh separated into different levels of detail. And down here, mean preview faces sets the minimum amount of faces that will be used as a preview on importing using Vray Proxy. And max preview faces sets the maximum amount of faces that will be used as a preview on importing the mesh using Vray Proxy. Now we can go ahead and press OK. After a few seconds, you can see the original dragon object has been deleted and replaced by a Vray Proxy object in the scene. And if I select the proxy object and go to its modify panel, you can see it is referencing the Vray mesh file that we just exported. You can see it says dragon.vr mesh, and if I click on this browse button, here is the dragon.vr mesh file that we just exported, and also a bunch of other Vray mesh files that we use in the sun and sky lesson in our lighting section. We can do the same process manually. So if I just hide this Vray Proxy underscore dragon object in the Explorer, first we need to create a Vray Proxy object from the create panel or from the Vray toolbar. So in the toolbar, select Vray Proxy and click anywhere in the viewport. And it immediately prompts you to define the .vr mesh file that you want to be used. In this case, let's select the dragon.vr mesh and press OK. Now we just need to adjust its transformation and put it where we want it to be. In this case, let's delete this new Vray proxy and unhide the automatically created proxy. Now if I go ahead and render the scene without doing anything else, you can see we get the exact same results when compared to our previous render, which was done with the original mesh. But right now we can go ahead and create as many copies of this Vray proxy as we want without choking the resources of our machine. Imagine if you want to distribute 1000 trees in a scene, it would be impossible without using Vray proxy. Now before going ahead and creating tons of copies from this Vray proxy object, let's go ahead and quickly take a look at some of the Vray proxy options in the modify panel. In the display section, you can control the display of the proxy object in the viewport. You can preview the mesh as a bounding box. You can preview from the file in edges or faces. You can display the object as a single point, or you can show the whole mesh with all its details. For now, let's set it to preview from file faces. If we would have exported an animated sequence, this animation section would be available to offset the animation to a specific frame or control its speed and stuff like that. Using this import as mesh button, you can import the geometry from the .vr mesh as an editable mesh object. We can also import Alembic files using the Vray proxy object. So if I click on this browse button and in the proxies folder, load this particles.abc file, which is an Alembic file, you can see if I just go to my perspective view momentarily, you can see we have the particle data stored in the Alembic file. Okay, let's get back to the camera view. Click on this browse button and load the dragon.vr mesh file again. Now let's populate our scene with dragons. Whoa. Let's go to the top view, shift drag the dragon on the X to the left side and make sure it's set to instance so the .vr mesh will be loaded only once, and set the number of copies to 4 maybe. Now select one of the proxies and change the display type to bounding box. It can help with the viewport, and especially if you are it really doesn't matter when you are having 100 200 copies, but if you are planning to have thousands and thousands of copies, it would be better to set the display to bounding box. Now select all the existing one and shift drag them on X to the right side. Select all of them and shift drag them on the Y as instance and set the number of instances to 10. Now we have 100 proxies in the scene and we'll be rendering about 14 million polys. Now if I go to my second physical camera and start rendering the scene, you can see the render starts immediately without any hassle, which is amazing. Let me just stop the render and show you the final result from the history list. Okay, there we have it. It's really amazing. Now, and this way we have rendered our complex heavy scene without having any problem. For the final render, let's go to the physical camera 003. It has depth of field on and its target is on this front dragon. Now let's render the scene and see what we get. So here is our final render. Let me go to the denoiser pass. All the dragons in the scene have a subsurface scattering material. We have almost 40 million polygons in the scene and we had absolutely no problem rendering such a heavy scene thanks to Vray Proxy. Now let me quickly show you another example. In the 0801 Vray Proxy scene 02, we have the same proxy file being distributed in different places of the scene. You just have a different material applied to it. By the way, you can apply different materials to your distributed Vray Proxy objects. If I go to the perspective view, we have the main light on the left side and this fill light on the right side of the camera. Also, if I open up the environment and effects window, we have this Vray environment fog with fog distance set to 400 centimeter and height to 300 centimeter. Also, scatter GI is enabled. And that's it. If I go ahead and render the scene, here is our final render. Let's first turn off all the color corrections and go to the denoiser pass. We get this moody render with the help of Vray Proxy and environment fog. Let's enable white balance and set the temperature to something like 10,000. Also enable color balance, make the shadows a bit bluer, maybe 0.3, and the highlights a bit yellower, maybe -0.5. So we get this beautiful moody render with Vray Proxy. So that's about Vray Proxy object, and I will see you in the next lesson.